Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Granick-Allen. It has been several months since we covered the federal government firearms ban, which was announced last May 1st. But things surrounding that ban seem to have been evolving weekly. When the ban was announced, there were many initial concerns. First, it was implemented through an order in council, meaning there was no legislative debate. It was just simply ordered. Secondly, 1,500 firearms were listed on that initial list, which included everything from grenade launchers, historical cannons, to hunting rifles. Furthermore, the timeline has been quite aggressive, especially with lockdowns in effect, yet the details are few. How would a buyback program be implemented? What happens after the amnesty period is over? What about Canadians who live in rural, northern, and Indigenous communities where firearms are essential to survival? But with increasing violence in our urban centers and many arguable claims that firearms are the weapon of choice in crime, we need to examine if this type of ban will help to alleviate those figures and ultimately save lives. Regardless of your position, do Canadians not deserve a debate on this matter, especially when this ban will affect the way people live and eat and work going forward? Well, joining me to discuss the impacts of this gun ban is Ryan Leef, former Yukon Member of Parliament, and Rod Giltaca, CEO and Executive Director at the Canadian Coalition for Firearm Rights. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me today. I look forward to this lively discussion on what's going on with our federal firearms ban. So first, I might ask you, Rod, could you please explain to our viewers who may have very little idea as to what this firearms ban is about? Could you please explain what is covered with this firearms ban and how it came to be?
Yeah, so I guess back on May 1st, 2020, the Liberal government used a legal instrument called an order in council. And they really misused it. They used it to ban, I guess, 1,500 types of firearms. There's all kinds of things, as you mentioned, in that ban. But basically, they effectively banned probably somewhere between 250,000 firearms that were legally owned previously, up to 1 million. We don't really know because the overwhelming majority of those firearms that were banned were non-restricted, so there's no registry any longer. Mm-hmm. But they've continued to ban more firearms behind closed doors without notifying the public ever since.
Okay, so how is that possible? Just Rod, to follow up, how is it possible that they can just continue adding to that list? That doesn't require any change in legislation, nothing. They just can continue doing this?
Well, that's a good question. How is that possible? Well, in Canada, the RCMP are responsible for managing a list. It's called the FRT, or Firearms Reference Table. And it's basically the RCMP laboratories, their firearm labs, opinion on whether a firearm meets the description of a prohibited firearm, restricted or non-restricted.
Right.
So the RCMP can change that in real time. They've decided that they'll start changing firearms that were previously non-restricted or restricted at their own whim, telling no one, changing the effective classification of those firearms. And so you have Canadians out there that have those firearms, have no idea that the change has happened, and now are in unauthorized possession of prohibited firearm.
Now, Ryan, you're a member of Parliament and you represent the Yukon. You've had experience previously dealing with firearms legislation while you were a sitting MP and even before and since. And you were a critic of the then Liberal long gun registry. How is this legislation different from that? Could you explain it to our viewers?
Well, the significant difference is the registry in the past was designed to, capture a registry of all firearms that exist in the country. And the Liberals then sold it as just a check and balances system that would again keep Canadians safer. They're using a similar language with this, which is their pitch that taking firearms or taking a certain collection of firearms and making them prohibited, getting them out of the hands of Canadians, is a pathway to keeping Canadians safer. We saw with the long gun registry that didn't work much. Much like we warned Canadians about early on that it was going to be ballooning in costs, ineffective, and really not achieve that policy piece that they wanted to achieve in terms of public safety. And they're going down the exact same road again with this piece of legislation. They're really using inflammatory language, I think, to take advantage of concerns and legitimate anxieties people have that aren't familiar with certain firearms, because
Right.
they're, not every Canadian's obviously familiar with firearms, but they're taking advantage of those anxieties and really trying to pursue a new angle of what the failed registry approach was as well. Now let's just ban some firearms, and hopefully that we can divide Canadians on this issue effectively enough that it provides some political advantage to them.
Right,
But
Ryan, I'm going to
ultimately,
cut in here. We've got to cut to commercial break, but we're going to pick this up right when we return. Rod, if we recall back last spring in 2020, the circumstances immediately preceding the introduction of this gun ban, and perhaps the impetus for it, was that crime spree where there was an active shooter who targeted, I guess, previous relationships he had, and firearms were involved. And that seemed to be a hot issue. Obviously, it was a very unfortunate situation, a very sad situation in our Canadian history, but that seemed to be firearms ban seemed to be almost a knee-jerk reaction to that. What are your thoughts on that? Are firearms really at the center of a lot of crime here in Canada?
Well, they aren't. And it wasn't a knee-jerk reaction. It was leveraging a national tragedy is what it was. And I don't even think anyone on the left side of this debate would even dispute that. They were sitting there with legislation ready to go for the right time when Canadians were emotionally vulnerable, and they saw their opportunity and they took it. There's a lot of misinformation around this particular situation. One, the Liberal government keeps calling it the biggest mass shooting in Canadian history. It's not. Polytechnic was the largest. Right. 13 people were shot and 9 people died in fires. But people say 22 people. They connect it with a mass shooting, certainly a terrible event. But accuracy is important in this debate. But the role the firearms played in this tragedy is another detail that people need to know. That the firearms that he had, I believe he had 5 firearms in addition to the one that he took from the police officer.
Right.
They were all from the United States or the police officer, other than one that he got through illegal means here in Canada.
So, knowing that this gentleman, this man, obtained his firearms illegally, then I guess the $1 million question is, well, how will restricting or banning legal firearms actually change how would that have had any impact on that kind of crime? Rod?
Well, it wouldn't. And Bill Blair, it's funny, Bill Blair went on a mainstream media show just after they unveiled their OIC and their gun ban. And he claimed that the OIC, now cemented in Bill C-21, would have stopped the Nova Scotia shooting. And that kind of rhetoric and disinformation, it's not misinformation, right? Misinformation's accidental. Disinformation's intentional. That level of disinformation, it's got to stop, because it's going nowhere good in this country.
Now, for me, I agree with you. Facts are very important. And of course, we're emotional beings. We have reactions to events, and that's a normal and good thing. But I always like to keep my emotions in check with facts, like how, and in this case, if actually having this kind of ban, would that have actually saved lives? And I think that's important. And I think maybe, Ryan, I'll offer you this question. A lot of Canadians don't understand that certain things like handguns, they are, in my opinion, essentially already banned. You cannot actually possess a handgun and walk around or shoot with it. It's a restricted firearm. Is that correct?
Well, Canadians can own certain types of handguns in the country for different purposes, but they come under strict measures of restricted firearms permitting, training courses, vetting, screening. And there's authorizations to transport. So the places that they can have them, carry them, and utilize them are highly controlled. So both on the non-restricted and restricted end of firearms in this country, we're probably the most vetted, ethical, safe, regulated group in any kind of property ownership capacity in this entire country. And we're also the most sort of scrutinized and penalized when we're talking about a public opinion category as well.
Okay, so let me follow up with you, Ryan. So Rod mentioned that he felt that the Liberals had this legislation ready to go, waiting for an opportune time. That's what he suggests. Would you agree with that? You were a former sitting member of Parliament. And if so, what is the intention? Why did this ban? Why was it necessary to come in? What was their intention of the Liberal government?
Well, there's the twofold question there is, one, did they have it ready? Absolutely, yes. You could see that through the disorganization of the OIC. I mean, it had websites, it had magazines, like periodical magazines listed as banned. One was a Black Rifle Coffee Company, simply because its logo actually had a firearm that was in that category. I mean, it just shows the complete disorganization and rush to move this to paper that they had And then secondly, the question, why would they do it? Well, simply as Rod already articulated, the timing was right for them. It drives the political wedge. It built on the heightened level of anxiety that some Canadians were feeling about it. And the Liberals measured that very carefully from a political standpoint.
So if I understand you correctly, you're suggesting that it's for political points?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever that would indicate that this would be a good public safety policy in terms of making Canadians safer. We already know interdiction at the borders, regional, local, municipal, provincial, federal governments are already having a hard time keeping guns coming across the border from the largest population next to us. So why would you take those resources away from valuable assets and focus them on taking firearms away from law-abiding Canadians?
Welcome back. Once again, I'm joined by Rod Giltaca, Executive Director and CEO of Canadian Coalition for Firearm Rights, and former Member of Parliament for the Yukon, Ryan Leef. Ryan, before the commercial break, we were discussing what the impetus is of this legislation, but it's here. This order in council has been passed. But how is it going to practically affect Canadians? Now, you live in a very different part of Canada than most Canadians. Most of them live in urban centres. I live in a rural community. You live in the Yukon. How important are firearms in life in the north?
Well, for us, it's just a way of life. We utilize firearms. I mean, I'd hazard a guess. Haven't done a community poll, but I'd hazard a guess that probably more than 75% of my neighbors would own a firearm. And as you move out to the communities, I'm in Whitehorse, so when you move out to the communities, that number would be much, much higher. So for us, they're common tools. You grow up with them. You utilize them for a way of life, whether that's hunting or trapping or just functionality in terms of safety in the wilderness. So for most Yukoners, the idea of firearms is just a normal day-to-day tool for us.
So if this ban, well, I mean, there's a bit of an amnesty kind of period, but if this ban takes full effect, how will this impact you?
Well, it's going to impact a number of firearms owners, first off. And I think secondly, it just sends a signal that's not healthy in the Canadian discourse on firearms ownership in the first place. Really, the government isn't painting a picture of firearms. They're painting a picture really of the people that own them when they say that these weapons are designed to kill as many people as possible in the quickest amount of time. Really what you're saying is that everybody who owns one is a criminal in waiting or fear your neighbor kind of idea. And it's a bizarre concept for us here in the Yukon. So I think just that overall picture painting that's going on as we wedge Canadians against each other in this mindset isn't healthy for a Canadian cultural context more than anything.
Okay, and Rod, I mean, Ryan has given us some good information there. For some Canadians watching this program, perhaps they're firearms owners, they probably have been following this. If they haven't, how will they know if their firearms are now going to be prohibited very soon?
Well, that's interesting because we are suing the government over this OIC, and we were unsuccessful in our seeking of an injunction. But the judge, when she started to look at all the evidence, especially the secret banning of firearms and no actual real mechanism for Canadians to know whether their firearm was banned or not, she didn't like that at all. And it spawned a new term for those firearms called unnamed variants. Oh. And she heard evidence of how, people, everyday Canadians that would have a firearms license would find out. And basically it's Twitter or Facebook or maybe a firearm forum. And something that could land you in jail for many years and strip you of all your firearms and become a criminal for the rest of your life. It's amazing how the government can think that behavior is good, but they're engaged in it regardless.
Okay, so that seems a little surprising that if I am a legal firearms owner, the government, the RCMP, has all my information. They know what I own for the most part, especially if it's a restricted firearm, because there's restricted and unrestricted. And again, very strict restrictions, it sounds redundant, on restricted firearms. So why can't they just email me a letter or mail me a letter rather?
Well, for something that is so, it's legally perilous, right? Because if they were to mail you a letter, you could say, well, I never got it, right? Okay. So they've chosen the easiest path, which is we're just not going to do anything, so we're not liable for anything. And you know what? If somebody gets arrested and thrown in jail and their life is destroyed, you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs, I guess, is the idea.
My goodness. And Ryan, again, you're a former member of Parliament. How often do we see orders in council come to the floor in the House of Commons?
Well, I certainly didn't see anything with this magnitude come by way of order in council. In fact, our government would have been, we wouldn't have done it, and we would have been highly criticized if we did do that. I mean, you're talking about a piece of legislation that has an outreach of over 2 to 3 million Canadians potentially impacted by this, and there are criminal consequences for it. This isn't a summary conviction act sort of business. This is something where people can end up in jail, and you're taking otherwise law-abiding Canadians that are part of what should be a government's fight for public safety policy, and you're not only turning them into criminals, you're trying to turn Canadians against Canadians in this kind of discussion. So we would have never done it, and it's a very, very rare and to me is an unacceptable way of going about it.
No, I think that's a very good point. And I think, and we'll talk about this when we come back from the break, but when we see orders in council, and again, to make it very clear, there is no debate on that. And the reason we elect members of Parliament is to go to the House of Commons, represent us, and be our voices there. Well, if their voice is being silenced, then how is that democracy? We're going to pick up this discussion right when we return from this commercial break. Stick around. Welcome back. We're here at Counterpoint, wrapping up our discussion and updating you on the Canadian firearms ban. Rod, we have discussed earlier in this episode the types of firearms that have been impacted by this ban. It started out as 1,500, seems to have ballooned since then. What are some of the firearms that have been banned or that are on the list to be banned that have kind of caught your surprise, or perhaps maybe they were unintended consequences of this ban?
Well, there are 22 rifles. 22 caliber rifles that have been banned. There's been 12 gauge shotguns that have been banned, a wide variety of them. Oddly enough, again, Bill Blair went into the House of Commons and said it was an absolute lie. Anyone, saying that 22 caliber rifles or 12 gauge shotguns have been banned, they absolutely have. We have the firearm reference table documents. I mean, it's easy to show. And basically with this order in council, they've essentially, I guess, I don't want to say destroyed the sport shooting, hobby or pursuit in Canada, but probably 70% destroyed it. And there's a lot of people that have spent their entire lives, participating in these sports and developing new ones, and all of it was just gone with a stroke of a pen, I guess, because gang members are shooting each other in downtown Toronto or whatever the excuse is. But it's been really devastating to a lot of Canadians.
Wow. Ryan, again, I'm coming to you just because you live in a certain area of Canada where you have some very particular insight and knowledge into lifestyles surrounding firearms. How are the Indigenous communities going to be impacted by this firearms? I think that's important to examine here.
Yeah, I think the question for all of us remains is some of the hypocrisy in the messaging that we're hearing, where on one hand, Bill Blair is saying that none of these firearms are used for hunting purposes and assuring Canadians on that front. And then in the very next breath saying where they are used for hunting purposes and it affects Aboriginal and First Nation communities, we'll honor the Section 33 exemption. So which is it? Does it affect them or doesn't it? So we're really unclear about that. But it's safe to say when you look at the table of firearms that are banned, that there are guaranteed going to be some of those that are utilized every single day here in the North. And as Rod already articulated, some of that will be unbeknownst to our First Nation Aboriginal communities that are out there in the field every day, just utilizing these firearms as a regular tool and not know they're banned. And
Ryan, with the buyback program that's going to be implemented, can you explain to our viewers what is that buyback program and how would that work?
Well, actually, I'd like to hear the government explain what that buyback program looks like, because I don't think we've heard a very clear answer on that. And again, it goes back to what I said earlier. Why on earth, when we're having trouble at the border, stopping these firearms from crossing the border by organized crime in the hands of gangs, why on earth would we divert any of Canada's human and fiscal resources toward paying for guns and taking them away from an otherwise law-abiding, safe, and ethical community?
Yeah, that makes total sense to me, Ryan. If we have a illegal smuggling situation happening at the border and all these firearms are illegal that are involved with crimes for the most part, then that sounds like where we need to pour our resources. In the minute we have left before we wrap up the show, Rod, I'm going to let you finish up. What are the next steps for the Canadian Coalition for Firearms Rights and gun firearms advocates in this country? Are there legal steps you're taking now since your injunction was rejected?
Well, our organization, along with a number of other plaintiffs, are suing the government over their misuse of an order in council. Order in councils were never meant to make sweeping legislation to confiscate property from hundreds of thousands of Canadians before. And we continue to, I guess, wage an information conflict with the government. They spread misinformation. We have a television show. We have a big social media presence. We just keep doing everything that we can to let Canadians know that what the Trudeau government is telling them isn't true, and it's wrong. And we're just going to continue to stand up against it.
Okay, well, that sounds like it's a tall order. We'll have to keep an eye on this and see how things progress. In the meantime, I guess within the next year, we may see this ban fully implemented. Thank you both so much for joining me today. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you.
When I read stories about increasing in gun crime and gun violence, of course, I'm very concerned, like most Canadians are. But when we find out that majority of these crimes involve illegal firearms, one has to wonder what imposing a firearms ban on legal firearms owners will have, what kind of impact, if any, on the gun crime in Canada. Lots to ponder as we continue to monitor this situation. For Counterpoint, I'm Tanya Granick-Allen.